Please join me in welcoming Zuhra Kasimova, who is a PhD candidate at the History Department at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and she holds an MA in Comparative History from Central European University in Budapest, Hungary. Her dissertation is titled A Hybrid Modernity, Forging Soviet Uzbekistan, 1941 to 1980. Her multivalent project touches upon Soviet modernity as a hybrid concept, the recentering of Uzbekistan and the diversity of Central Asia as a region. Her research encompasses issues of religion, gender, the complexities of Soviet identity, and the specificities of Uzbek spaces. She has published several articles, including recent work in the Journal of Studies, the Journal for the Studies of Islam and Muslim Societies, and in Ab Imperio, which includes actually a publication of archival documents about the Nukus Museum. Today, she's presenting a paper titled The Improbable Museum, Igor Savitsky's Collection of Russian Avant-Garde and Karakalpak Art in Soviet Central Asia. Please join me in welcoming Zuhra, and I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you very much, Marisa, for such a kind introduction. Let me start sharing my screen so I can show you some slides. But first of all, I would like to thank Jordan Center and Sasha for organizing this talk. I want to thank Marisa for kindly hosting this event. And I would also like to thank Marinika Babanazarova, who's a former director of Igor Savitsky Museum in Nukus, and her sister for sharing information from the private archive and photo collection. Also, I'd like to thank Chavdar Georgiev and Amanda Pope. They're directors of the documentary about Savitsky Museum, and they kindly shared the information that they collected while making this film. I would also like to thank my academic advisor, Marina McGilner. Thanks to her, I was able to publish the primary documents about this amazing museum in an article in Ab Imperio Academic Journal. So I'll start by introducing Igor Savitsky and his museum, by explaining how the museum came to being, and I will try to focus on several parts of this collection, which are very distinct, but at the same time, as I'm trying to argue, they constitute the same, these parts are, it's unimaginable to see this museum without any of these parts, the Karakalpak art or the Russian Avant-Garde or the ancient Khwarezmian artifacts. So I'll try to show how these different parts of the collection are actually part of the larger whole. So this is a quote from one of the letters that Savitsky wrote. He says, "I understand that the problem of Nukus scare people away, for everyone considers Nukus a hole in the wall, a place in the middle of nowhere. However, it is not so, because for one, only in Nukus was it possible to create such an improbable museum, the one impossible to build elsewhere." So Savitsky Museum was founded in 1966 in Karakalpak in Central Asia, and it houses a unique and extensive collection of Russian avant-garde art. In the popular imagination, this museum usually emerges as a Louvre of the desert, Louvre of the steppes, which is located in the so-called Soviet Polynesia. Correspondingly, in this popular tropes, Igor Savitsky himself, the founder of the museum, emerges as a Central Asian Tretyakov, Soviet Schindler of avant-garde, and so on. These tropes strike one as blatantly orientalizing, exoticizing, and meaningless because they serve to replace the lack of information and the lack of access to the archival documents. As a result, there is no academic history of this museum as a collection, as an institution. In my reconstruction of this museum's history, I intend to show the complex hybrid nature of this institution, which combined Karakalpak authentic primitive art with Soviet avant-garde paintings, as well as popular crafts with revolutionary art. The implied similarity between the two seemingly very different art forms helped to revive the creative context of Soviet nation building of the 1920s, when the revolutionary avant-garde searched for inspiration in elementary forms of popular artistic creativity and served as the antithesis of artificially stabilized national Uzbek art in Tashkent. So in reconstructing this story, I will show how the museum's founders, not only Savitsky, but also the Karakalpak natives who worked alongside Savitsky to make this museum possible, as well as their opponents in the capital of the Uzbek Republic in Tashkent, negotiated and reimagined the limits and the meaning of Soviet and national by manipulating the Central Soviet authorities in Moscow. So in the decades following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Savitsky Karakalpak State Museum of Art has acquired true international fame, but relatively few people have actually visited it. Nukus is located some 800 kilometers away and a 15-hour train ride from the Uzbek capital Tashkent. And despite its not being an ideal destination for tourism, international visitors actually do come to Nukus, mostly just to see this museum. Other than that, it's just basically Nukus is located between two deserts, and other than museum, it's not much to see there. So despite growing interest, little scholarly work, as I've said, had been done. And mostly we hear about this museum's avant-garde collection, but we usually don't get information about the local Karakalpak art, which is also part of the collection. So I'll show you some of the avant-garde pictures from the collection. Of course, they are stunning, and some of the artists that Savitsky collected, some of the works of the artists that Savitsky collected are not represented anywhere in Russia, for example. So it's a very, very unique collection indeed. This is a local Uzbek artist. It's kind of difficult to imagine, of course, these pictures being painted in the Soviet times after avant-garde was banned. So these are just some of the articles that had been published about the Savitsky collection after the collapse of Soviet Union. Most of them, of course, talk only about the Russian avant-garde part of the collection. So there were also a couple of documentary movies made about Savitsky. Of course, these movies kind of focus mostly on Savitsky as a sole creator of the museum. And I'll try to shed light on some other people, mostly local Karakalpaks and local Karakalpak intelligentsia members who, alongside Savitsky, worked to make this museum a reality. So locked in by Karakum and Kizilkum deserts, Nukus, originally a very provincial town named after Karakalpak clan, becomes the capital city of the Karakalpak Autonomous Soviet Republic in 1932. It was here in Nukus in 1966 that Savitsky created his unique museum. So in order to create this museum, Savitsky had to actually secure funding because, of course, under the Soviet regime, one had to make sure that there was an official funding. So Savitsky was an artist, ethnographer, art collector. He was originally born in Kiev, raised and educated in Moscow. He spent more than 30 years of his life in the Uzbek Republic and in Karakalpak Autonomous Republic. He successfully socialized into Central Asian cultural and academic circles, eventually becoming part of them. So some of the questions that I was asking were, how can Savitsky's peculiar life trajectory be explained and what motivated him? How did this unorthodox museum become possible given the negative attitude of the official Soviet ideology towards avant-garde art? How could an individual create a new state museum, the only form of museum actually possible in the Soviet Union, on a whim, while the government was watchfully controlling the already tight financial resources allotted to cultural institutions? How did the state museum under the control of the Republican and Union ministries of culture manage to procure Russian and Soviet avant-garde in parallel with Karakalpak folk art objects? Was it possible that Savitsky single-handedly promoted such an unusual collection of artifacts in the Soviet Art Museum in the National Republic? So as these questions were piling up, it was somewhat difficult to find answers to these without having access to the museum archive. Luckily, the former director of the museum, Marinika Babanazarova, helped me to get very, very limited, but still to get access to the museum archive. And she shared some of the documents she had in her personal collection. And that kind of helped to shed light on how the museum was created. So because usually we think that Savitsky basically collected Karakalpak artifacts just to hide in plain sight that his original intentions were to collect the Russian avant-garde. I'm trying to dismantle this myth and to show that each of the parts of this collection, despite how different they were equally important to Savitsky. So I have to go back to Savitsky. Born in Kiev 1915 to the Jewish-Polish upper middle-class family, young Igor Savitsky spoke fluent French and was fond of painting and music. Savitsky was only 4 years old when his maternal grandfather, the eminent philologist and professor Timofey Florinsky, perished at the hands of Chekists in 1919. In 1920, the 5-year-old Savitsky moves to Moscow with his parents. That's where he grows up, he goes to school, and he enters the art school. Igor Savitsky's coming of age coincided with the 1930s. Collectivization, rapid industrialization, political repressions, purges of national cadres, reversal of Korenizatsiya policies with across-the-board Russification, and establishment of the socialist realist canon to replace now outlawed avant-garde art. Although the 1920s, with their idealistic fervor for revolutionary art and nation building, were not Savitsky's lived experience, the decade was retroactively idealized as a golden age of freedom in which to experiment and create. So Savitsky goes to the art school right before the World War II. And in 1941, at the age of 26, he was accepted to the Moscow State Art Institute. Then the war starts off in 1942. He's exempt from the draft because of certain illness. He is evacuated to Samarkand. Samarkand is a city in the Uzbek Republic. He evacuates with the art school and with many of the prominent faculty members, prominent artists such as Robert Falk, Nikolai Ulyanov, Konstantin Istomin, and others. So for many artists, forced evacuation to Central Asia, despite the wartime hardships, served as a new source of artistic inspiration. Oriental bazaars, architectural monuments, colorful clothes of local population inspired the avant-garde artists of the 1920s, for example, to create bright multicultural paintings. So now, under very different circumstances, in evacuation, it became possible to create something new again. This involuntary trip to Central Asia was Savitsky's first introduction to the region. At this time and place, he socialized with artists who lived and worked in Central Asia and was introduced to what later become known as the Turkestani avant-garde. It's mostly the Russian painters who moved to Central Asia during the revolution, right after the revolution, and stayed. So after the war, Savitsky has to return back to Moscow, right? Because there was a re-evacuation back to Moscow and he has to go back and work as an artist. But what happens is actually he finds a way to stay, or actually to come back to Central Asia. He's introduced to Sergei Tolstov, who was the head of the archaeological expedition, the Khrizmian archaeological expedition, which is arguably one of the largest Soviet archaeological digs that spanned decades. It was very ambitious. It started in the 1930s and lasted until the collapse of the Soviet Union. So through this archaeological expedition, where Savitsky serves as a sketch artist, he's able to come back to Central Asia, but this time not to Samarkand, not to Uzbek Republic, but to the Nukus, to Karakalpak Autonomous Republic, which is part of the Uzbekistan at the time and until today. So there in Nukus, Savitsky befriends local Karakalpak members of the Academy of Sciences, and he becomes friends with Marat Nurmuhamedov in late 1950s. So Savitsky becomes friends with Soviet ethnographers who are writing about Karakalpaks, that they're not actually just, a very small ethnic group, but they are actually a nation in itself. So participating in this expedition further deepened Savitsky's artistic fascination and scientific interest in the region. So Marat Nurmuhamedov at the time when he meets Savitsky is only 27 years old. Savitsky is 42. It's somewhat difficult to imagine this friendship because they are of different age, but they had some similarities in their biographies. Savitsky's parents kind of disappeared in a sense. I found no traces of them in the archives. I don't know what exactly happened to them, but Savitsky's grandfather, as I've said, had been purged. His uncle had been purged. The rest of the family had fled to Europe. His surviving uncle was political emigre who was a professor at Columbia University, actually. His grandmother fled to France. So, and Nurmuhamedov's family actually were the first Karakalpak local intelligentsia who were purged as well. So Nurmuhamedov grows up in an orphanage. His father is purged as a nationalist in the 1930s under Stalin, of course. So there are similarities in their life trajectories, in their early life, that Savitsky's family is kind of suffered under the Soviet regime and Nurmuhamedov's family alike. So Nurmuhamedov's view of the Karakalpaks, of course, differs from the established preconceptions of Karakalpaks as somewhat backward nation that has no culture of its own. And of course, here we have to remember the Stalinist conception of the nation, right, that he wrote, I think in 1915, even before the Russian Revolution, when Stalin says a nation is a group of people who have very distinct culture, economy, language, way of life, and language. So according to this definition of a nation, Karakalpaks clearly lacked very specific culture because as originally as nomadic population, they shared a lot of commonalities, both in language, traditions, and culture with neighboring Uzbeks, which were more sedentary, but also with other nomadic nations as Kazakhs and Turkmens. So if we go back and look at the map, we see that the Karakalpak Republic it neighbors Turkmens, it neighbors Kazakhs, and it neighbors Uzbeks. So as we know, by the time when Savitsky was in Central Asia, was in Karakalpakstan 1950s, all the republics in Central Asia, except Karakalpaks, had the national republic of their own. Only Karakalpakstan had still had a status of autonomous republic and was not a full-fledged national republic. So what I'm trying to argue here is that Nurmuhamedov, of course, as an educated first generation Soviet academic, from Karakalpaks, he saw the opportunity to elevate the status of Karakalpaks and to claim that they do, scientifically claim that they do have a culture which is very specific and distinct in its own rights, that it's not just something which can only be compared to local nomadic tribes, that they did have a very distinct culture. And Savitsky educated in arts, but then, getting interested in ethnography and the art of the Karakalpaks during the Tolstoy's expedition, he kind of helps Nurmuhamedov to further this argument about very unique specificity of Karakalpak art. So it seems like Savitsky, alongside Nurmuhamedov and some other local Karakalpak elite members, envisioned a bold project of Karakalpak nation building akin to the Soviet indigenization policies of the 1920s. But of course, a big difference between the indigenization policies, Korenizatsiya of 1920s, which was a very top-down process, which was planned and executed in Moscow. This time we see a very kind of grassroots movement for the locals themselves, who have by 1950s and 1960s fully acquired the understanding of speaking Soviet, right? They know how to use all the terminology, they know how to play, by the Soviet rules. The locals are the ones who are vouching for Savitsky, who's a newcomer to the region, who's not a local, but seeing a potential ally in him, they are supporting him and hoping that this will allow them to elevate the status of the republic to the national one, from autonomous and somewhat financially subjugated to the Uzbeks at the time. So, so the meeting of primitive art, as of course the Karakalpak art would be considered at the time, with Russian avant-garde, and the ambition to create national artistic elites who would pursue cultural politics on behalf of the Karakalpak nation, presented a drastic contrast to the post-World War II ossifying Stalinist socialist realist canon. So that's how we actually see the similarities between the Russian avant-garde and local Karakalpak art, in a sense that these are both very unique tendencies which are trying to fly under the radar of the official culture. So what happens is that Savitsky kind of strikes a deal, unofficial deal, with the local Karakalpaks, asking them to create the museum, to fund it. He goes to the local obkom. It's like I don't know how to exactly translate it. It's like local communist branch, and asks them to give him a paperwork for opening up a museum. Even this context is not very very common for the Soviet era, because usually the creation of the museum is something which is agreed on either in Moscow or in the capital republic of the nation. It should have been Tashkent in Uzbek Republic and not in Nukuz. But Savitsky talks to the local elites, and who are, of course, in the Ministry of Culture. And so they liked the project, they okayed it, and they created the museum. And only after the creation of the museum, these are the paintings by Savitsky. He stopped making any paintings after he started the museum, pretty much. This pictures of Savitsky in the desert. This is Savitsky with local Karakalpak artifacts. These are probably the headdress that local Karakalpak women were wearing. So these are the other artifacts from the Karakalpak part of the collection. And so Savitsky writes a book about the local crafts of Karakalpaks, and he compares it to neighboring republics, to Turkmen and Kazakh crafts and arts, and he effectively argues that these are very distinct, that they're not the same, and this is a distinct culture. So Savitsky and his Karakalpak allies. So Savitsky does talk to local elites. He convinces them to have a museum, and so only after the museum had been created, Savitsky writes a letter. So he's officially now director of this art museum in Nukuz. And so now they have to write to the Uzbek Republic, to Tashkent Ministry of Culture, saying that we have created the museum and now we want money from you basically for it. This is again highly unusual situation. But Savitsky writes a letter to the then first secretary of the Uzbek Communist Party, to Sharaf Rashidov, in 1967, a year, well, maybe like 6-7 months after the creation of the museum. Again, this is pretty much unheard of. You cannot do such thing without the approval of the first secretary, but somehow they do it. And so he writes to Rashidov and says that a comparison of the works of art in these Soviet peoples will allow us for the first time to see the emergence of a clear picture of the originality and distinctness of these cultures, as well as the kinship and interconnectedness of their art forms. He says that he's gonna exhibit in his museum works not only of Karakalpaks, but of Uzbeks and neighboring Turkmens and Kazakhs, and that it is very important in ethnographic and artistic terms to see these collections alongside each other. And then Savitsky says in his letter, the Karakalpak State Museum of Art, conceived as a center for the promotion of fine arts in the Karakalpak Republic, should consist of the following 3 pre-approved sections. First, it's a national/folk applied art of the Karakalpaks, as well that of Uzbeks, Kazakhs, and Turkmens living in the Karakalpak Republic. Second, it's a pre-modern artifacts of ancient Khwarezm. These are the artifacts that he acquired through that archaeological dig. And these artifacts are supposed to prove, again, in a very Soviet kind of developmental ideas about the nation, that Khwarezm, that ancient territories where Karakalpaks are living now, it had a very long standing tradition of its own, spanning centuries. So, and lastly, the third section, he says, is going to be, contemporary fine art. And this contemporary fine art section is a section under which Savitsky collected Russian avant-garde, local Uzbek contemporary artists, contemporary Karakalpak artists. And so basically, but because Savitsky never defined what the contemporary fine art section meant, and nobody ever questioned it, because everybody thought, oh, he's going to create a first ever Karakalpak National Art Museum, fine, we'll let him do it. No one ever questioned his judgment in what kind of contemporary art pieces he's going to collect. That's how he's able to fly under the radar and basically use the government money to amass this huge collection of Russian avant-garde, even though the government, of course, bans, like unofficially bans avant-garde, but he uses the same government's money to basically buy these pieces. So these are the pictures from late 1960s from the museum, and you see the locals, local Karakalpaks visiting the museum. Of course, this is a big thing for them. This is the first ever art museum they ever had. And you see how they look not only at the national crafts of their own nation, but they also look at the contemporary art. And there were also young artists who would work and have a workshop in the museum. And so Savitsky was also kind of helping out the young Karakalpak artists who were just starting out to develop their craft. So this is just the copy of that letter that Savitsky wrote to the first secretary of Uzbek Republic about creation of the museum. So what happens afterwards is that Savitsky, he is very emboldened by the fact that he was able to create this museum. He got some money to have some acquisitions, but still most of his artifacts in late 1960s and early 1970s are still coming from the local Karakalpaks. It's he was just basically going around in various parts of the Karakalpakstan, just knocking on doors, talking to locals, and collecting what they had from like basically pre-revolutionary times, like some, hand-woven carpets, some kind of like local jewelry, which was handmade. So this is the large part of his collection at the time. So as the museum is established and he tries to get more money for its funding, he started traveling to Moscow and Leningrad to finally kind of start amassing these collections of the Russian avant-garde paintings. So that's what Savitsky says. That's how he basically tries to rekindle his, Central Russia connections. He spent some time in Karakalpakstan by late 1960s, early 1970s, and so now he wants to kind of rekindle his old connections from the times when he was an art student in Moscow Art Institute. So what he does, he contacts his old friends, his colleagues, the widows of those avant-garde painters that he knows. He contacts the widow of his mentor, very famous avant-garde artist, Robert Falk. So he contacts them and he says, open this museum, but it's in the middle of nowhere. So why don't you sell me some of your paintings? So this is an excerpt from one of the letters he wrote to Nina Zelenskaya and Zinaida Ivanova. These two were, prominent sculptors. They were students of Vera Mukhina, I think. So he says, in Tashkent, which controls the Uzbek and the Karakalpak art scene, everything is lagging so far behind real art, and taste is so anti-artistic that maneuvering among the reefs of human unculturedness has become a dangerous enterprise. He laments like that. He tells them, oh, it's so difficult to have a real art here in the desert. Could you please help me out? So little by little, he creates this network of artists and artists' children and widows who are willing to sell the Russian avant-garde paintings to him. But of course, what happens is that how the Soviet museum system worked, you do not have the money up front to pay for those pieces. You have to kind of acquire them on temporary basis. Then you have to, like, a couple times a year, have like a big meeting with a local Ministry of Culture representatives who have to look at each piece and see if they kind of meet the socialist realist canon, um, and then either to accept them and pay for them or to reject them. But what he does is he basically brings all these paintings. Just imagine the sheer amount of time, and like just imagine how far Nukus is from Moscow or Leningrad. It's thousands of kilometers, and of course there is no easy way of getting these paintings from Moscow to Nukus. He travels by train, and he brings all these paintings there. And of course, because local Karakalpaks are still approving of his museum, they are okaying all of these acquisitions without really looking into what exactly is he buying. And because Nukus is so far from Moscow, nobody really realizes what is it that he exactly collects. That is how it became possible for him to amass this huge collection of Russian avant-garde, which is now considered like the second largest collection of Russian avant-garde in the world. Um, so um, So what happens is that at some point, of course, when in 1970s, the Soviet economy suffers a lot, and he cannot keep up, buying all these like hundreds and hundreds of paintings every year. This is still a very provincial city, and so at some point, the Ministry of Culture is very worried about this, and they're like, we cannot be spending so much money on the local Nukus Museum, more than we spend in the capital city of Tashkent, for example. So at some point in 1970s, people start looking into what is he doing, why his spendings are so high. And so there are a couple of people who are sent from Moscow to look at the collection and see what exactly is going on in Nukus. But somehow those people kind of approve of the collection. I think they're just probably, they're surprised, they're in awe. They don't even realize how this was possible to put all these things together. So somehow Savitsky gets a positive feedback, and the collection stays. And he doesn't suffer any serious problems as a result. So basically, what happens after in 1982, Savitsky gets very sick, and by 1984, when he passes away, Marinika, the daughter of his longtime Karakalpak friend, Marat Nurmuhamedov, takes over the museum. The museum survives, even though in late 1980s they tried to kind of, Moscow tries to kind of repatriate the Russian avant-garde part, because by 1980s, it's quite possible, already by 1970s, I think, it's more or less okay to acquire and to exhibit some of the avant-garde paintings. And by 1980s, Moscow is trying to take some of these paintings back. Marinika kind of says exactly what Savitsky said when he was still alive in a letter to Brezhnev. Savitsky wrote directly to Brezhnev and said, I imagine this collection as a inseparable whole. I cannot just give up any of the pieces of it because it will stop making any sense. So the collection survives in its original form, but what I'm trying to this is still work in progress. It's supposed to be a chapter in my dissertation. I'm trying to see at what point Savitsky kind of stopped focusing mostly on the local Karakalpak art and turned to mostly to the Russian avant-garde, because we still see that there are these prominent parts of the collection, but I still have to do additional work to go back to the archives and see what is it that makes him at some point in 1970s more interested in avant-garde. Is it because he realized that the Karakalpak project, as he envisioned it, was probably not sustainable? Because as we know, Karakalpak republic had never acquired the status of the national one. It was an autonomous republic throughout the Soviet era, and it's still, I mean, even now, it's still part of the Uzbek Republic. So it's difficult to say whether Savitsky kind of gave up on the Karakalpak nation building project, or he just saw that it was limited to a degree and he could not collect or demonstrate any more than he did. So this is the part which I still have to find answers for, but I would be very interested to see your reaction and comments on these. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. I will be, since everyone else is muted, I will be the sort of representative applauder. Thank you so much for your presentation, Zohra. And we'll open up the floor for questions. You can use the hand raising function through Zoom, and I'll do my best to call on everyone. And you can also just enter them in the chats, and I'll moderate from there as well. So I see some hands up initially visually, so why don't we start? Lisa Velkener, I see your hand up. I'll just pass the floor. And please unmute yourself, Will, if you're speaking. Lisa, I'm afraid I can't hear you. Could you mind unmuting yourself?
Are you talking to me? Are you talking to me?
I was not. Lisa
Okay.
Velkener, I see you're speaking, but unfortunately we can't hear you. Sasha, is there
Yeah, so everybody should be able to unmute themselves at this time. The unmuting capabilities have been turned back on. Lisa, I'm gonna click ask. Oh, there we go, perfect.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question. I would like to add to your bibliography, because I think the first time I heard about the collection was at least 30 years ago, maybe more, from John Bolt. So BO at UCLA. So you might look into his writings. I don't know whether he had written anything about it, but anyway, it was on the radar a while ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
great. Lida Voronina, I see your hands up.
Okay, a couple of questions. First, was a catalog of the Russian Avant-Garde collection and Nukas ever published? And the second question, once you study this collection, are you familiar with the monumental study of the Russian Avant-Garde and the book, which was done by Olga Rothenberg? The book is called «Неужели кто-то вспомнит, что мы были?» It's a marvelous book. And I was wondering, the artists whose works are in Nukus Museum, are they partly the same as in this book? Because I'm mostly familiar with this art through this book, through this study, not Nukus. I wish I would go and see the collection, but and also, is museum presented in the web? You know, like we can go and see the art itself. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. These are really great questions. So I'll take them one by one. In regards to the catalog, there are a couple of art, I don't know how to call them correctly, like there are collections of select paintings from this collection, specifically the avant-garde, both the Russian avant-garde and what they now call Turkestani avant-garde. It's a Russian artist who ended up in Central Asia in 1920s and afterwards. So there are the select works that are published. But as far as I know, there is no exhaustive catalog published officially. And I mean, this is as far as I know.
Because to my knowledge, it's 40,000 pieces out there. 40,000. It's just like, it's beyond comprehension.
Yes, I know this is a very difficult question. I usually try not to get into the politics about the museum because we are afraid it might hurt the collection in various ways. But the administrative problem within the last like 5 years was because Marinika Babanazarova, who was the director of the museum since Savitsky passed away in 1984, and she was the director from 1984 up until 2015. She was the one who kept the collection intact when the Soviet Union collapsed and there were still debts to pay in Soviet rubles back then for the, for the large part of the collection which still was not fully paid for. She kind of, dealt with all these issues. She kept the collection intact for all these decades. And then there was some administrative issues. And so she was forced to resign in 2015. And after that, there was a quick succession of various people who were heading the museum. And that's why we don't, as researchers, it's very, very difficult to get access to the archive of the museum. I had access to very, very limited folders. And that's why my story is mostly about 1960s when the museum was created, in early 1970s. The later folders, they did not allow me to look at. But I mean, I'm trying to be very cautious and not criticize anyone and not to because I'm still hoping that at some point, hopefully soon, the access will be more generously provided to researchers, both locally and the international ones, so that this situation would change. But for now, because of the limited access to the collection and to the archive, it is very difficult to, I think, talk about publication of like complex information, like all exhaustive information about the museum. As to the website, actually, there are people who are doing it on like, non-governmental level. There is a researcher, art researcher from, he's based in Canada, Boris Chukovich, and there are several other people, including Svetlana Garshenina, who's in France, who had created the online collection of whatever information was publicly available. They just asked people who visited the museum, just as visitors, to snap the pictures, just even on their iPhones. I contributed to that collection as well, and put it online. I can look up the website later on and maybe share it in the chat section. Say it again.
When did you go there?
I was there last time in 2018. I was not able to go to Karakalpak in 2019, and then the pandemic happened this summer. So, I mean, last time I was there was 2018. So Chukovich and Garshenina, they collected whatever was publicly available, the paintings which were actually exhibited as part of the collection in the museum. So regular people would just go and take the pictures. And so we would have at least more or less comprehensive information of what had ever been exhibited. Of course, the question then remains, what about the works that had never been exhibited right on the walls of the museum? What about the thing which is in Zapasniki, right? But this is beyond, something that I can informatively address, because I personally had never been in Zapasniki. I only had access, and again, I'm not an art historian. I'm just, and I'm not an art critic. I only worked with the archive of the museum to see how the museum was created, how was it became possible. So whatever I know might not be exhaustive information about this. So I'm trying to be cautious in what I say in order not to create more problems for the museum. And with regards to your last question about the book, yes, I am aware of the book, and I think of Rothenberg's book. And I think some of the works are from the Nukus collection, and there are several other publications, one from 1989, I think, that talks about these artists whose works ended up in the Nukus collection and whose works are not represented anywhere else, I think. Or if represented, then in very, very limited way. I can look that up too. I think it's called Avant-Garde Остановленный на бегу.
Allison Hilton, I think you said you wanted to add something here, and then we'll go to Paul Randt's question and continue down the order.
This will be fairly brief. One of the last developments that goes under the leadership of Marinika Babanazarova was paying a lot of attention to current museum studies, museological methods, and that meant really enormous emphasis on what's called usually museum education and interpretation. And that fits in exactly with what you've just said, Suhra, about making the museum more and more accessible. They got some nice new facilities too, making it more accessible to ordinary people. But, and I've looked at all of those websites very carefully because I wanted to use some of them in a class about that very subject. What is the responsibility of a museum director and so forth? And sadly, I mean, she had a wonderful grant from the Carnegie Institute just a few years before that, and was essentially, I think, in New York as well as Washington and other places, being part of the larger cohort of museum people, let's say, not just directors. And I think that was a tremendous step forward. NUCUS obviously supported those efforts very much. Anyway, it was extremely exciting. And I'm grateful that you're being so careful. And maybe it will come back. Maybe what she started will be able to develop gradually, slowly and gradually. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you very much for this comment.
Paul Rent, please.
Right. Thank you very much. And thank you for the Jordan Center for this great talk, and Zora. This is sort of a comment and sort of a question, or an invitation. I think, so for context, I used to work or volunteer at the Kostyaev Museum in Almaty. And there is a way to view the foundation well, there's a way to view Savitsky and the creation of the NUCUS Museum in the context of a lot of transportation of art within the Soviet Union. And so kind of most famously, the evacuation of the Hermitage to Sverdlovsk, but then it continues, and there's there are provincial traveling exhibitions, etc. And a good portion of this does end up in Soviet Central Asia and stays. And beyond that, there are then stories about directors of the Kostyaev, as well as other provincial museums, doing similar things to what Savitsky did in terms of traveling to Moscow and Leningrad and collecting paintings from widows and children and etc. and bringing it back. And so there's I don't know, I actually can't verify this, but there is a story in the Kostyaev that the director in the 60s and 70s traveled and took some of the kind of asked for the paintings of Pavel Filonov from his widow and brought them back. I can't verify that, but they're without reducing in any way kind of what Savitsky accomplished or the importance of the NUCUS Museum in particular. There is also a network here that I've been really interested in for a long time, but since I don't work in academia and actually don't work in the art world anymore, I have no capacity to explore it, but would be super interested to have people begin to explore that more deeply.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. I'm pretty sure that what Savitsky was doing with establishing networks was not very unique, but I guess the way he created the museum as a national museum of local art, and then he was collecting Russian avant-garde. Because for example, when I worked in the Russian State Museum of Literature and Art in Moscow, Regali, I remember reading all these correspondence between Savitsky and these widows. And for example, when he wrote to widow of Falk, to Shokin Krotova, of course, at some point, she says, in 1970s, it's already possible. Like Armenian Art Museum wanted to get acquire some of the paintings by Falk. At that point, it was already somewhat possible. Maybe like 2 or 3 they could acquire. And she talks about Kostyaev Museum, Art Museum as well. So, I mean, in late 1970s, I think Savitsky was already not alone, who was, hunting down these avant-garde paintings and trying to bid for them. So, but in late 1960s and early 1970s, perhaps it was still somewhat difficult to do. So,
yeah. I guess, sorry, and I guess to the point of the question to get to is, the interest in situating Savitsky within these networks of very brave people, right? Who were doing, maybe by the 1970s, we don't call them so brave anymore. But prior to that, kind of brave directors who understood the value of both local avant-garde art, and avant-garde art from the capital and the metropolis. Anyway.
Yeah, but I guess this is actually a good question in the sense that sometimes it's really difficult to determine. Sometimes Savitsky was buying, basically he was saving, right? That's the trope that we already have, that he was saving these avant-garde painters from oblivion, right? Because otherwise, no museum would buy them at that time, and they were just housed in at home and not in a very great condition. So it was difficult to preserve the paintings. And Savitsky was just buying sometimes everything from any given artist, which is a good and bad thing in itself, because on one hand, he is saving those from being just, discarded and ended up somewhere in trash, right? If the children, grandchildren don't care about it anymore, don't have a space to store it, right? Just imagine these Soviet kommunalkas, where would you store this? And so he would buy them all. But on the other hand, then that's how the situation happened when people were already interested in avant-garde. And Nukus Museum was the only one, for example, had artifacts by this artist. So, and then nobody really travels to Nukus all that much. So that kind of insulates the artist, right? So there are different kind of questions that we have here.
Thank you very much. Fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Great. And so then from the chats, Vladimir Ryshkovsky asks, what was the first avant-garde art that was acquired by Savitsky and placed in the museum on display?
That's a great question. Actually, the first one, according to the inventory numbers, like inventarные номера, that I looked at, and I think that's what Marinika used to tell, and that the first one was by Alexander Volkov. It's a Russian artist who moved to Central Asia in 1920s, and he stayed. So the first painting that was ever that was acquired originally, and it has number 1 in the inventory. It's work by Alexander Volkov. So that's also an interesting story, how Savitsky basically made connections and friendships with Russian artists working in Central Asia, and through their families and their children, people started believing him, because otherwise, when he just created the museum in 1966, his museum did not even have an official seal. If any of you ever worked with or read about the Soviet institutions, if you don't have an official seal to put on every document that you're signing, well, your signature doesn't mean a lot. You need to have a letterhead and a seal, and he didn't have it yet. So he would just, handwrite like raspiska, like a little voucher, like saying, I am taking this and this painting, and I'm gonna pay you sometime in the future, God knows when. And these local Central Asian Russian artists were the ones who knew him firsthand, and they said, we can trust him. We know he's a good guy. So that's another network other than the Russian one, but the Central Asian one that he developed.
Thank you. Just continuing on in the questions in the chats. Anton Durgan asks, what is the current status of the Karakalpak nation, and are they still trying to achieve independence?
Administratively, Karakalpak Republic is part of the Uzbek Republic. So, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, I guess by the 1970s and 80s already, maybe that's the reason why Savitsky abandoned the project, is that basically there's no change of the administrative status and elevation of the republics. We don't see a lot of the administrative change in republics in 1960s, 70s, and 80s already. So whatever had been crystallized in 30s and 40s as, national territorial delimitation pretty much stays as is. Because in 1920s and 30s, we see a lot of how different provinces or regions are, which originally were part of the Uzbek Republic, become part of the Tajik Republic, or Fergana Valley is divided, right, between several Central Asian republics. But, after the war, after World War II, we don't really see any changes in the Soviet administrative structure all that much. So, we don't see any change at all. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, these changes become meaningless because there's no such entity as, federative structure of the Soviet Union where you have separate republics. So, yeah, they stayed as they are, the part of the Uzbek Republic.
Great. And so we actually have another question sort of about the space of Karakalpak. Evan Alterman asks about the sort of phrasing in your paper of the desert landscape as Soviet Polynesia, and was sort of wondering when this term was coined and when it was used and in what contexts.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I should have probably made it more clear, but I do not seriously take seriously these orientalizing tropes of Soviet Polynesia, Savitsky as a Central Asian Tretyakov or savior of the Russian avant-garde. These are all post-Soviet tropes that had emerged because I think that's when people more or less started, finding out about the museum. And that's when the foreign newspapers run articles on the museum, and that's from where I think these tropes originate, just to make some sense and to compare, to have some comparative perspective into what this museum meant in a larger kind of context, right? But I don't think I take them seriously. These are just the names used in the newspapers and some popular articles, in some movies about the museum. But this is, of course, very orientalizing trope, which I don't think has any serious meaning in and of itself.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Anne Eatkin-Moss, and I just sent you a chat. Would you like to pose your question yourself, just because there's a series there? And I want to ensure that they're all getting proper airtime.
Sure, sorry, it was long. So I was curious about whether or not the museum played an active role in any exchange of artists in the region in Central Asia and the Middle East. I mean, I'm particularly interested in a current research project on Iran, but I was generally interested in if there was any, interpollination of this collection further outside the boundaries of the Soviet Union. And then I guess, kind of related to that conceptually, and this is more of the art historian question, was my question about the story that Savitsky is telling about the connection of this Russian avant-garde idea and the local art. I mean, is he telling a story that's more like a Soviet internationalist political argument, or is there an aesthetic one about artistic development? Kind of reminds me of the Barnes Museum in Philadelphia, right? The local Quaker art next to Gauguin, and finding just formal abstract connections between the two.
Yeah, these are all great questions. So first about connections of this museum to others. Interestingly enough, I'll try to connect this to the other question I saw in the chat, whether the museum had any exhibitions that traveled outside of Central Asia, for example, right? So interestingly enough, in Soviet times, parts of the very small parts of the collection did travel to Eastern Europe even, and to Moscow. But mostly I think the Russian avant-garde part, and not the Karakalpak one. The Karakalpak part, I think they exhibited during what they call dekadas. It's like 10 days of each national republic, like a celebration of national specificity, which would happen throughout the Soviet era, right? So like Karakalpak dekadas, then they would exhibit some of the Karakalpak art elsewhere. But mostly during the Soviet time, the parts of the exhibition that traveled were the modern Russian part. They exhibited them in Tallinn and Riga and in some other cities. But what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as far as I know, they only had relatively recently, I think in 2017, there was an exhibition of the Russian avant-garde part of the collection that traveled to Moscow. So it was a really big thing. I think it was at Pushkin Museum. I'm just afraid to say something wrong. So that was a really, really big thing. But other than that, in the post-Soviet years, no part of the collection traveled all that much. There might be some, I don't know, administrative, political issues behind it, but I just know that they mostly did not exhibit it elsewhere. I think there was an idea to have the exhibition in France, to have an exhibition in the United States. For whatever reasons, it had never been done. And there are all sorts of difficulties with kind of moving the collection into take some of the pieces to various exhibitions. So in terms of like abstract connections between avant-garde and local art, I think that's for sure. That's how Savitsky actually saw the connections, besides, you know, the obvious connections of creating the Karakalpak art collection in the Karakalpak nation. He did see some connections between the primitive and, you know, avant-garde, and also another part of the collection which is usually forgotten is the ancient Kharizmian artifacts from those archaeological digs that also kind of contributes to this very, very unique and different parts of the collection. So I think Savitsky somehow envisioned very progressive progression of art from like ancient Kharizmian to contemporary Karakalpak art to Russian avant-garde. Even though seemingly it seems like these are very different parts, he somehow saw kind of larger abstract connection between these. And of course, I think it also in line with what Tolstov, the head of this expedition, archaeological expedition, saw in how the ancient Kharizmian art was transpired and transformed over the centuries. And, you know, you see it in the Karakalpak native ornaments, for example, or stuff like that. So there are a lot of, you know, connecting issues between these parts of the collection, I'm sure, but I'm not an art historian. I'm trying to be very careful with how
Can I ask a tiny follow-up about the first part? Because I was curious about the museum being used as a teaching collection and people coming to the museum. So artists from other countries or from the center coming to the museum and using it as a teaching collection in any way.
Yeah, as a teaching collection, I think it was used extensively as a teaching collection for only local Karakalpaks in the Soviet time, because that was pretty much the only space which was equipped to educate local Karakalpak artists. And that's where most of them grew up professionally in the art museum. And that's why they had such a close connection to Savitsky. And also there was at some point in 1970s, Savitsky even brought some copies of the French, you know, sculptures and masterpieces and placed them in the museum so that the young Karakalpak artists would be able to visit and to, you know, to just make copies while in the museum. So in that sense, I think it was rather unprecedented, because I don't think there were such workshops organized even in Tashkent or, you know, in other parts of Uzbekistan. So in that regard, I think Savitsky was rather, you know, forward-looking, and because he himself had a training as an artist, I think he understood much deeper the needs of those artists than anybody else.
Thank you. So also coming from the chats, Masha Chlanova asks how you're defining the sort of the Russian avant-garde in your research and writing, and also what quantifies this as the kind of second largest collection of Russian avant-garde in the world?
Yeah, very good questions. So what defines the second largest collection is what unofficially the museum is known as second largest after the Ruski Muzey. Russian museum. Of course, I or probably nobody else can definitively quantify any of this, because I do not have an exact number of avant-garde paintings that the Savitsky museum houses. This is just how the museum is well known, and it's dubbed as the second largest, arguably. Yeah, I don't have an exact number for that. What quantified the collection? I see the correction for the question in the chat. Actually, I asked who quantified the collection as such. That's a good question. I don't know who exactly started to call Nuku's museum collection as the second largest avant-garde collection in the world, but somehow it appeared in all those Western popular articles in newspapers, and that's basically how everybody dubs it as that, as the second largest collection of avant-garde. But I do not know who was the first ever person who said that. Then there was another question which I forgot.
About how you were defining the Russian avant-garde.
yeah, Russian avant-garde, I'm pretty much using whatever definition of avant-garde painters was there, according to art collectors, art historians. Most of them that Savitsky collected were parts of those famous exhibitions, like I don't know, Falk, Voznесensky, Istomin, I don't remember all the names now. So it's more or less kind of established, what do you call it? Like established canon who are considered like avant-garde artists. Of course, there's no official taxonomy because most of these, early 1920s avant-garde exhibitions were pretty much very spontaneous and unofficial in themselves, like,
Great. Matthew Stevenson has a question from the chats asking about the inventory you mentioned and whether the works were marked on the stretchers or reversed with inventory numbers, and if any of the works have left the collection either through sale or otherwise in its history.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure I understand the question about the inventory, if it's possible to clarify it.
I think.
Oh, I see the question.
I think it's a question just about what the museum cataloging practices are for recording inventory numbers.
That's a good question. I'm trying to remember from the times when I was in the museum. I do not recall seeing inventory numbers on the, on the sticker, which is applied to the painting itself. But I've seen the, copies of the inventory, of the original inventory, of course, as most of the Soviet museums, I don't know about other art museums, they do have two types of inventory. One, the acquisition one, the other one is a temporary one where you kind of, take the works in, and then if you fully pay them off, they get entered into the permanent inventory. So all these inventories, they do exist. They're there from Soviet times, and they kept them pretty meticulously. And I don't know if they have like, the official practice of having the description, the acquisition information, and the photograph of it. I don't know if like back in 1960s, they did photographs the painting to include to the inventory. But other than that, they kept all the information very meticulously. I even remember reading in the Russian State Archive of Literature and Art, where some of the painters or the widows of the painters are kind of sending letters back to Savitsky saying, oh, we saw that, you exhibited this painting, but you kind of changed the title a little. We want to keep it as it was originally named. So please be very careful with how you represent the information. So, as far as I know from the letters and from the archive of the museum, they were very, very serious and meticulously addressed the issues of inventory. In terms of the sales, I think no piece from the collection had ever been sold. That was the wish of the Savitsky, and that's what Marinika Vabanazarova always uphold, that the collection has to remain as is. And, each piece in the collection is has to stay there, because otherwise the collection kind of loses its meaning. And yeah, as far as I know, there were times when, financially it was difficult. And I think Marinika talks about it in one of the interviews, that she was approached by some people and said, these paintings are worth like millions and maybe we should. And she says, no, but this is a wish of Savitsky to kind of keep the collection as is, as it was originally put together.
Thank you very much. The reason in part that I asked that question, of course, I work very closely in the Russian avant-garde field, and you're probably very aware recently of the Ludwig Cologne exhibition into Russian avant-garde, original and fake. And there was much discussion about where some works had historically left certain collections in the Soviet Union, even as early as the 70s, and had been swapped, faked with works in national collections. And so the community is almost putting together telltale signs and signifiers. So when I actually speak about inventory numbers or markings, I was just curious to know, literally on the back of the works, whether those inventory numbers, if they're so organized, were ever actually marked or put on them. Because it's interesting you say about Volkov, for example, was inventory number 1. On the back of the picture, was there any way of, was it marked as such?
That's a good question. I have no way of knowing it because,
No.
of course, I would not be allowed to just,
Of
move the
course,
painting when I'm just a visitor. So this is probably a question that has to be asked to art historians and curators. Marinika for
course.
sure knows. I don't know if it's marked on the back. I would
Right.
imagine that it is.
Somehow. And was Savitsky in competition with Kostakis, the other great pioneer? You
that's-
maybe have mentioned that at the beginning of your talk, and I just missed 10 minutes.
Yeah, I actually haven't mentioned Kostakis, but that's I was going to actually bring the example of Kostakis to you in response to your question about some unofficial sales of some paintings as early as 1970s in the Soviet Union. And I was going to mention Kostakis' collection by saying people had unofficial collections at their homes, literally, right? So of course, it's very difficult to trace what ended up where, and of course, it's possible that somebody was selling, especially because Kostakis, he was working for the diplomatic missions, right, in Moscow, and he had access to all sorts of foreigners, even knowing that at the time, of course, KGB would be closely watching. So it is quite possible that there were collections privately owned in people's private apartments. So there is a chance that paintings would end up elsewhere. I looked into it. I was also very curious to see if Savitsky actually knew Kostakis. I found no mention of that in either of their writings. I don't even found any mention that they were aware of each other's existence. And of course, it might be for various reasons. First, that I just didn't come across the fact that they actually knew each other, but it is somewhere recorded. Second, they came from a very different worlds in a sense of their social circles, I believe, because Savitsky was a professional artist and Kostakis was someone who educated himself on avant-garde, and and if you look at the artists that they collected mostly different artists, and so, and also Kostakis had that collection of icons, of Russian Orthodox icons. So I think their interests somewhat diverged a lot. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lida Voronina, I see your hand up.
Okay. Could you share a little bit personal information with us? How come you became so interested in Nukus Museum and Russian avant-garde art? And also, when you first visited museum, who among artists presented there was the most striking? Whom did you like best? And why?
These are great questions. I think I grew up in Tashkent, in the capital of Uzbekistan, and I was aware of the collection because my sister was an artist, and she traveled there by train. Back then, it was the only, cheap option available. It's a long journey, but she always spoke very highly of the collection, and I got interested in that just on a very personal level, even before I started grad school. I don't recall actually how it happened so that I became interested professionally as a historian of Soviet Union, of Soviet Central Asia in the collection. It was perhaps because I was interested in various national cadres, national elites in the post-World War II, and that's how probably I came across the Savitsky story from a different angle. I was trying to work against the narrative, traditional narrative of like, oh, Savitsky single-handedly opposed the Soviet ban on avant-garde. It's just difficult to imagine that one person single-handedly could do anything, especially under the Soviet regime. It was clear that he had some allies. He had someone who was helping him out, especially given that he was a foreigner. I mean, he was a Russian, not speaking local language. I mean, I saw in the museum archives, I saw the little, notes. He was trying to learn some Karakalpak, like writing down the translation of the Karakalpak word into into Russian. But of course, it's obvious that he needed somebody on the ground who would be helping him out and like showing him the ways how to speak to local bureaucracy, because Savitsky was very, in a sense, very naive person. That's very apparent from the letters he wrote. Very naive, idealistic person. And so he was sometimes like a child. He was just, you know, fascinated by collecting and, you know, looking for some treasures, you know. And so it was obvious that there was somebody else who was helping him out to speak Soviet and to write these letters to first secretaries and to Brezhnev and to everyone. So, I mean, it was just became obvious that there is a larger story behind it, and they just wanted to work against the conventional narrative and to maybe bring these local Karakalpak elites back to this story, so that, you know, Marinika, because she's a very a person who would never speak of herself, you know, and like praise herself or her family, she would never say that. But I believe that somebody had to tell the story that her father, Marat Nurmuhamedov, the local first Karakalpak academician, he was responsible for this collection as much as Savitsky was. And I just wanted to bring voice to locals who actually made this collection possible alongside Savitsky. And these are the people who did not have such a stellar education Savitsky had in Moscow, probably originally, but then they worked their way up. You know, like Nurmuhamedov got educated in Moscow. He defended dissertation on Soviet on Karakalpak folklore in 1959, I think. So these are the, you know, indigenous people who want to research their own art and history and literature. I thought it's important to tell their stories alongside Savitsky's. It's not only about Russian avant-garde or Savitsky, it's about Karakalpaks as well.
And about your experience in the museum.
Yeah, I think first time I visited in 2017, and then I was back in 2018. That's about it. It's very difficult to, I mean, it's difficult to be there. Like, just imagine, it's really a desert. That's what was so obvious from Savitsky's letters. And I was fascinated by this man who basically from Moscow, where you have, you know, like a great art scene, you have people to socialize with. And he left this all behind. He had a flat, he had an apartment in Moscow that belonged to him. He left everything behind. Just imagine 1950s and 60s, having a flat of your own, one bedroom, whatever he had in Moscow, and abandoning it and living your whole life in the desert, where people speak different language and you don't have any art institutions. So, you know, when you go to Nukuz, I went only in summer because I was a grad student by then and I could travel only in summer. And it's difficult to even convey the heat and just, you know, it's just all gray. Like you see the pavement, which is basically melting. That's how hot it is, and that's why basically no roads are paved. I remember how I first arrived to Nukuz on the plane from Tashkent, and I just walked. It was the early evening. I walked from the airport, from local airport to the hotel, which was located right across the street from the museum. And all you see is just, you know, July, sweltering heat, even in the evening. And you just see these unpaved roads with dust because the pavement is just melting. And, you know, it's just I know that it probably also sounds like I'm orientalizing, but I was just trying to imagine Savitsky in this desert. So what made him stay? What made him envision this museum, as he says, in the middle of nowhere?
So, how about art itself?
Yeah, art, I don't think I have any, I have a favorite painting, to be honest. Maybe it's also because I also saw what Savitsky saw, or I tried to see what he saw, that this is a collection which is, you know, you have to see it as a whole and not just separate pieces. Because if you look at there are some photographs of the collection, of the exhibition in 1966 and 67, and he had only 7 tiny rooms originally when he opened up the museum. So he was forced to put the paintings so close to each other, which was totally against any official way of exhibiting any works of art. They were so close to each other, there was literally no space on the wall. That was the only way he was able to exhibit his paintings. And I think, I mean, now the museum has 2 larger buildings and they don't put the paintings so close to one another, but you kind of still see how there is that space which is almost fully, you know, like there are just paintings you know, like a carpet. You see all these different colors, and you know, so that's why it's so difficult to just have a favorite one single painting. I don't know.
Oh, you relate to the art through individual artists, so not art in general, but you know, maybe you like most Raphael, I don't know, or Levitan, but it's just interesting, the personal eyes, personal experience, and you're among few articulate people who can share the artistic experience with us. So that's what I was wondering about.
Yeah, well, but then probably the most personal for me were the paintings made by Savitsky himself. I think several people spoke in their interviews about Savitsky that, you know, it's also interesting that he was a painter himself. It's just difficult to imagine a collector who is a painter himself, because usually people want to paint or they want to collect. It doesn't converge all that often. And at some point, of course, his collecting became the main purpose, and he gradually gave away his painting. And I think the last paintings he had made are dated 1970s. I don't remember exactly, but several people in their interviews said that, you know, Falk, for example, who was his mentor in the art school, he used to tell that you don't have sense of color or something, and so he was kind of discouraged by some of his mentors. And just imagine the pain of the person who loves painting, who imagines his life, his profession as this, but then somebody whom he really respects tells him, you're not good in this. So just imagine that probably that made something to Savitsky in a sense that he decided, okay, I want to still enjoy art, maybe I should collect it. I don't know, I don't want to get into psychoanalyzing Savitsky, you know, but when you see his paintings in the museum, of course, I believe that in his lifetime they were not there. I'm sure it's Marinika who, you know, cherished those and put them there. And so you see that he does have an amazing sense of color, because he mostly paints what he sees in the desert. He paints these, you know, sand. He paints these, you know, little, you know, villages and trees. And it is a very interesting sense of color, very unique one.
Thank you. We've got two questions from the chats that are both sort of about the more general framework of collection. So Maria Mileva asks whether he collected any socialist realist works of art. And Aaron Hutchinson is inquiring as to whether there were other existing museums of Karakalpak applied art before Savitsky founded his museum.
Thank you, great question. So socialist realist art, that's another question that I myself had, because I was trying to see if Savitsky collected something that he would put on the walls when he had these commissions or somebody, you know, from Moscow visiting. So, you know, just to put a facade. I don't know exactly. I saw some, you know, socialist realist kind of paintings of Stalin that were in the collection. And of course, we have these Turkestani avant-garde painters who are painting in somewhat socialist realist themes, but of course, the content might look socialist realist, is like building the dams, building some construction work, or like metal workers, like, you know, red chaihanas, red, you know, tea houses, that might look like it's like, you know, conforming to revolutionary art, to some, you know, socialist realist canon. But of course, the execution of those works, the form is very, very avant-gardist in terms of the color, in terms of how those people are painted, that, you know, they're not just boring kind of conforming pictures. So I think I showed some of them, like Karahan's work, that shows like building of some dam, where it's like it's perfectly socialist realist picture in itself, but the way, you know, those people are depicted, it's very interesting and unique. So the second question was about
was about Karakalpak applied art.
Yeah.
And whether there were other.
Yeah, that's also an interesting question, because there was no museum of Karakalpak art before. Because, for example, art museum for Uzbek applied arts in Tashkent was created, I think, in early 50s in Tashkent. And Karakalpak did not have an art museum of any kind until Savitsky created one. So Savitsky created his museum in 1966 on the basis of what was called a краеведческий museum. But краеведческий, it's like local history museums, which every single Soviet city had. It's just basically about the history of the city, you know, some relation to the revolution, like some historical facts here and there. So it has nothing to do with the art in general, and not with Karakalpak's in particular.
Thank you. I, of course, work on the Krayevedический Museum, so you're speaking my language right now. There are sort of two questions that are about the sort of framing of this museum in general. One of them is asking, this is again from Erin Hutchinson, about whether we can call this museum a sort of from below project of defining and constructing national culture in the Soviet Union. And then somebody else, and I've lost track of whose name this is, but asks about how you would define hybridity in the case of the Nukus Museum, given that this is a sort of term coming out of your own work.
Mm-hmm. I would think this is an example of a museum created from below, just because Savitsky and his Karakalpak allies were the people who got inspired and came up with the idea of the museum. Again, looking at the letters that Marinika kindly shared with me of her father writing to Savitsky about the museum. There were times when Savitsky would say something like, "It's not working, like I cannot deal with this bureaucracy anymore. I'm just gonna leave everything and go back to Moscow." And then his friend Marat Nurmuhamedov kind of helps him out, supports him, and gives him advice on how to deal with bureaucracy and stuff like that. So I would argue that this is a museum created from below, because these were people's initiatives and not, you know, someone from Moscow saying, "Oh, we don't have a Karakalpak art museum, we have to create it," like just because it's, you know, some official ceremony and whatnot about Karakalpak, so we have to just do it just because. But on the other hand, of course, the question remains that, I mean, they created it with Soviet money, but on the other hand, there's no other way to do it back then. So it's just interesting, because even though it was created by initiative from below, they did kind of pitch this story to local Karakalpak art ministry, Ministry of Culture, and then those spoke to Ministry of Culture in Tashkent, because Tashkent had to fund this all, because Tashkent in Uzbekistan were the guys who were receiving all the money from Moscow to then distribute it to all the 12 provinces in the autonomous republic, right? So in a sense, of course, this is a story from below, but, you know, Nurmuhamedov and other Karakalpak allies that Savitsky had, that's the most interesting part. There were indigenous elites who kind of, you know, learned to speak. They were perfectly bilingual. They spoke both Karakalpak and Russian, and some of them spoke Uzbek as well. Some of them were trilingual. And so they knew how to effectively play these things. And most of them were actually in official bureaucracy. Marat Nurmuhamedov was the head of the, I think, local branch of the Academy of Sciences. So he had his ways of, like, you know, bringing official discourse in to help out Savitsky. And other people who Savitsky asked for help in the Ministry of Culture, of course, they were also, you know, like official party bureaucrats. So in that sense, it's very difficult to say 100% that it's a story from below, but in a sense that these are indigenous people who are trying to, you know, to carve out the place for their own culture. I think we can say that.
Then the second half is from, and I found the name, so Vladimir Ryshkovsky, about the idea of hybridity in the Nukus Museum.
Yeah, I mean, originally was just brainstorming and thinking that this is just really difficult to imagine this collection as a single thing in itself, because, you know, you have Russian Avant-Garde, which was considered in the official Soviet taxonomy as, you know, it's still a modern contemporary art, even if it was frowned upon at some point. And then you have this considered primitive Karakalpak stuff, and then you have these ancient artifacts. But as I'm listening to your questions and examples that you're bringing, that this was not super uncommon, maybe I should, I don't know, reconsider my argument a little and see it as one of the many examples of Soviet hybrid enterprises and not just be one unique museum. Maybe there were more museums like this envisioned in indigenous culture and contemporary art.
Alisa, we'll just get to you. I'm just going to run through a couple of quick questions in the order, but just so you know, I've marked you down. Ulker Yusofa wants to ask about whether or not there were sort of more generalized repressions of artists during these periods and how the USSR impacted artists from this time more broadly. You spoke a little bit about the museum, but.
I missed the part about repression, sorry, maybe I should just read it.
Yeah, it's the reading is how the USSR impacted on other artists. Were there any repressions during this period?
I mean, I'm not researching the lives of any of these artists, but I think Marinika did a good job. They were also trying to publish, I'm not sure what's the status of this, like memoirs, something like this about Savitsky. So I think there are the, recollections and, of some of these artists, what they said about Savitsky back then and, relatively recently. And I think Marinika mentions in one of the documentaries made about the museum that she tried to trace, to track down the life trajectories of these painters, because of course, when Savitsky would buy their paintings in Moscow and bring them to Nukus, he himself sometimes did not have a lot of information about them because avant-garde was banned. And so these people at the time might or might not be the official members, of the, what's it called? The artists union. So that means they don't have an officially published biography or autobiography that everyone was supposed to write. So in that regard, Marinika was the one who, after the death of Savitsky, had to piece together these stories about this artist. One of them, I think she mentions, was in some mental institution for some reason, and then he was totally lost. Nobody knew where he lived, but he lived somewhere in Uzbekistan. He was a Russian artist who came from Moscow, I think. So, I mean, she's the one who kind of reconstructs the stories of these people. So maybe we should wait while something like this comes up in English. I'm not sure they published this in English though. But the documentary, The Desert of the Forbidden Art, I think it has some of these stories. So if you watch it, you'll definitely get a glimpse of what she was able to collect, to retrieve the stories of these people.
I think this actually segues nicely into Raviza's question about whether or not you think Savitsky sort of remains a controversial character today.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I don't think he was ever controversial in a sense, because there was that large, consensus about Savitsky being a person who saved the paintings, and he was nice enough to collect local art. So I don't see a lot of controversy in his representation. I think I'm just trying to kind of challenge that non-controversial representation of Savitsky as a simple person who just decided to collect this and that. I'm just trying to see maybe there was more to him than just this. Maybe he saw, through the training that he got and through the people that he socialized with, both on the Karakalpak side and in the archaeological expedition, because Tolstov, the head of that expedition, he was, of course, one of the students of famous ethnographer Mar, who spoke a lot about, the Soviet nationality system, about the progression of a ethnic group to the full-fledged nationality, and all in the very Marxist concepts. So Tolstov was a very vocal supporter of some of these ideas, and he was the one who co-authored or authored, I don't remember exactly, the history of peoples of Uzbekistan, published in 1950s. Tolstov was a big voice in writing these national histories in Central Asia. So I always thought that Savitsky was the one who kind of learned some of his ideas from Tolstov, and he wanted to apply what Tolstov analyze the Uzbeks and do something similar about Karakalpaks, but through the culture, it seems. But I mean, this is the hypothesis that I have that I still have to support with evidence.
Thank you. Raviza, I see that you posted a clarification in the message that I'll just, with your permission, or I'll just read quickly, clarifying that what she meant is that his story is one of that's sort of an anti-systems person who collected not just art, but sort of specifically forbidden art.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, for sure. But again, we see that there are more people like him nowadays, not only him and Kostakis, but other people who collected the art just to save it, probably from oblivion, from being destroyed, you know.
Thank you. There's a longer question in the chat that I'll just read straight through from Richard Schmidt. How does the history of the Savitsky Museum and its role as a space for subversive avant-garde art beyond the glance of the Soviet center reflect the unique political position of Uzbek SSR within the USSR under the rule of Sharaf Rashidov, given that he manages to establish a quasi-independent republic within the Soviet Union until the discovery of the cotton scandal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting question. Uzbek Communist Party and Sharaf Rashidov in particular were banking on this story and kind of using the Savitsky collection as, you know, as an example, because we know from the history of the Uzbek Communist Party about Rashidov that Rashidov did like to use certain positive aspects happening in the republic to his advantage when he negotiated in Moscow, right? This is, again, you're right in pointing out that the local elites in both Karakalpak and Uzbek cases are very important. These are, you know, the first generation of local elites who grew up Soviet, and so they speak Soviet, whatever that means, very masterfully. They know how to speak to people in Moscow. They know how to speak to their locals in local republics in their native language. They know how to negotiate on these various different levels. They are these trickster personas who are, you know, like putting one mask when they're in Moscow and when they're talking to Brezhnev or Khrushchev, for example, right? And when they're back home and talking to locals. So this is a story of this hybridity when they're perfectly aware of the mask they have to wear in Moscow and then people they have to be back in their home republics. But I'm not sure that there is any connection between Savitsky and Rashidov as such, because it seems like Savitsky's network was basically just Karakalpak ministries through which he was trying to negotiate his story. And then he was always trying to bypass the Uzbeks and appeal directly to Moscow. That's, again, the example when he writes directly to Brezhnev. He doesn't write to Rashidov to ask for support. For Savitsky, this is, again, the perfect Soviet system where you as a national republic work on your national local level, and then you appeal directly to the center. So in that sense, for Savitsky, Uzbeks are just the people who don't want to give him money all that much, it seems. So I don't see any big connection between Rashidov and Savitsky Museum, and I haven't found anywhere in the archives that Rashidov was talking about the Savitsky Museum, about Karakalpak project as something, you know, like a successful story to get something from the party bosses in Moscow, even though Rashidov is known for using many different success stories from Uzbek Republic, right, to kind of better his cause. And we know that Rashidov was the only, perhaps, first secretary of Uzbek Republic who stayed in his position for so long, because before he got in the position in 1950s, right, there were 4 or 5 who changed in a very quick succession. And he kind of cements his status by always talking about how successful Uzbek Republic is, and, you know, in terms of culture and cotton production and economy and agriculture and whatnot. But somehow I don't think he ever uses the Karakalpak project. And that again speaks to the idea that there are these rivaling projects of nation building that kind of don't converge.
Thank you. Lisa Velkenier. If you'd like to unmute yourself. Sorry, I think you have to unmute yourself for us to hear you.
So,
We
yeah,
can't
okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Me and electronics don't get along, but anyway, here I am. I just wanted to add to all the information you've given, namely private art collection. And the two I knew about were Ilya Zilberstein's, and he gave it to the Pushkin Museum. I think it was mainly Russian 19th century art. And then Sarabyanov, the art historian, Dmitry Sarabyanov, had a good collection of his own, namely of the avant-garde, namely Popova. And I have no idea what happened to it. Maybe his family kept it, but anyway, just to add a little to all the information you have given us. And thank you for your lecture.
Yeah, thank you very much for this information. I did not know about Sarabyanov collection, but that just kind of reminded me about the, that Savitsky was not only this person who was in between these different narratives in terms of like he was non-native in Karakalpakstan or something like this, but he was also in a very kind of gray zone in a sense of who he was professionally, because Sarabyanov, of course, is a very famous, professional art critic, right? And Savitsky was neither. He was just a professional artist who decided to collect stuff, and so sometimes he really does not fit into this, figure of art collector, and so he didn't really, as far as I know from the archival documents I saw, Savitsky did not really fit into this art collectors group of people who were, speaking to one another and maybe sharing some information and sometimes maybe competing to buy the same artifacts. Savitsky was on his own in that regard. He kind of created his own networks to communicate with.
Thank you.
All right, I think I will take advantage of a break in the questions and just ask sort of a final question, unless anyone else has anything they need to jump in with. I'm curious about the sort of contemporary curatorial state of the museum. I know that you said there are all these different collections of the avant-garde collection, the sort of more ethnographic collection, the Karakalpak art. And I'm curious, are these collections displayed together? Are they sort of heterogeneously mixed up, or are they divided by rooms? I think you said there were 7 rooms in total. So is there, I'm so just curious about the curatorial structuring and whether or not it's changed since the founding in the 70s.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So as far as I know from the archival sources, I have only a couple pictures how the exhibition looked like under Savitsky. He did change the exhibitions around very, very often, even though he had a very small number of people who would be, who would be visiting from outside the Karakalpak Republic, but he still kind of put these collections. For example, when he had a collection of the Robert Falk's works, he sent a letter to Falk's widow saying, "Oh, I exhibited all of his works that I acquired from you in one room, and his son's work, because Falk's son was also an artist, in one room, and it's such a beautiful, beautiful exhibition." So because of the lack of space, Savitsky used to change things around, and as far as I know, he exhibited everything all together. Like, for example, there was a part of the collection that had the wooden carved wood of native Karakalpak peoples. He would put them just in the room where the paintings were on the walls, and it was such a just interesting, surreal experience to see these very, very different art forms together. And so I think this kind of logic they retained up till now, because when I was in the museum last time in 2018, they did have these wooden carvings all together in the rooms with the avant-garde and with the contemporary Karakalpak paintings. So I think they tried to retain this hybrid representation just to showcase whatever they had all together. But I think now, because they have 2 separate buildings, there might be that some of the most famous avant-garde paintings are in in one building, and the contemporary Karakalpaks are mostly in the second building. But I don't know how, how often do they change things around, whether it's a permanent exhibition or not. Yeah, but of course, when Savitsky had his tiny 7 rooms, it was very, very different. It was another struggle that he had to, to push for, creating a new building solely dedicated to this collection. So, I mean, another interesting story is that because of the climate in the desert, they had to figure out how to preserve this painting so there would not be the cracks on the surface. So he kind of imitated how they, I think there was a collection in Dresden of some paintings that were just put in some, like, I don't know how to call it exactly, like, they're not permanently open and on the walls, you just have to pull them out to see them, and then you put them back. So he implemented something like this to make sure that the paintings are preserved, because otherwise it's just such a dry climate that it's impossible to do so. And nowadays, I think what they do with the wooden carvings, which are also very prone to, difficult to preserve them, so they just put the bowls of water to make sure that there is some humidity. So they try to, kind of figure out how to preserve these in the very, very unkind climate, in a sense. So kind of appreciate it that they come up with a new solution.
Thank you so much. Unless there are any final questions, I'd like to ask everyone to thank our speaker, Zuhra Kasimova, for a really excellent talk and for your generosity in answering all of these questions. And so, again, I will be the representative applauder, but please feel free to use your reaction emojis.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it, and for all the questions.